The Middle East Institute hosted this hour-and-a-half event.
Thank you for joining us. We're actually going to get ready to get started here for what is certainly an early beginning for a Hill Forum, but our friends are joining us live, so we're going to need to actually begin on time. Realizing that our Hill staffers and other colleagues will be joining us as they come in. First of all, I want to thank you on behalf of the MidAmr Group and the Middle East Institute for joining us today. We like to do these series on the Hill to focus on a variety of topics that we think are important and perhaps not getting ample attention, particularly between members of Congress and their staff. So in an attempt to do that, we've been coming up here on a fairly regular basis and meeting with you, talking with you, and having these discussions. I want to thank again David Chambers and the staff of MEI for sponsoring this event, the hard work that they've done here. We're very grateful and appreciative. We are talking about Islamic charities, the concept of Zakat, and the post-September 11th environment. There is no question after September 11th that terrorists have used charitable contributions as a means to fund some of their terrorist activities. That is clear. What is the challenge for us in terms of the world community today is to figure out how we address this problem while at the same time maintaining a respect for the Islamic tradition of Zakat, which is a required charitable contribution, and understanding that a lot of great need is being met by these charitable contributions that are originating from the Middle East. Programs that a lot of institutions do not fund, refugee camps that a lot of places have not been paying attention to. So there's this balancing act that has to happen. It's clearly a problem, but at the same time, there's a need to address it in a way that doesn't sort of compound the problem by making the situation worse on the humanitarian side. Joining us to have this discussion today is Ambassador Ned Walker. He's the president of the Middle East Institute. Prior to assuming his position at MEI, Mr. Walker was Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. He is a career Foreign Service officer for nearly 35 years and has served as the ambassador to Israel from 1997 to 99, ambassador to the Arab Republic of Egypt from 1994 to 1997. Also with us today is Juliette Rossant. She is a journalist and author based in Washington, D.C. here. As a journalist, she's reported chiefly for Business Weekly and was first stationed in Istanbul, Paris, Moscow, and Jeddah. At Forbes magazine, she wrote the Middle East section of the Billionaires list, and as a result has a tremendous expertise to talk about who these folks are making these charitable contributions today. Also with us is Ms. Abir al-Fouti, who's traveled perhaps the farthest. She is here from Saudi Arabia. She is the director of the Prince Sultan bin Abdulaziz Humanitarian City in Riyadh. She maintains the city's diverse array of programs. The Prince Sultan bin Abdulaziz Humanitarian City was created by the Al Saud Foundation, which strives to promote humanitarian, educational, social, and cultural services in the kingdom and around the world. And lastly, but certainly not least, is Hussein Ibish. He is the director, as of tomorrow, we're in transition, director of the Washington Bureau of the Daily Star, the largest English-Lebanese language daily. He just left as the communications director of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. Hussein is an analyst on Middle East issues and has made thousands of appearances on a range of networks and print journalists. We thank him for being with us today. We're going to try to address sort of four principal areas in our discussion. What has been done to crack down on this problem specifically? Who are the charitable contributions? We want to give you an example of who are the charitable contributions coming from. We also want to give you an example of a program that exists because of Zakat and the importance of charitable giving in Islam. And then we also want to look at how this problem has affected contributions here in the United States, primarily from Arab Americans and American Muslims. So we try to dabble in each of these. The importance of this is always you, so we will do this fairly briefly and then open it up for questions and answers. I'd like to start by acknowledging Ambassador Walker.
Thank you very much. I think think we ought to start by recognizing that subjects today aren't really the key to taking care of terrorism. We could stop all the financing and people could still find enough money to strap a bomb on them and blow other people up. It is important to try and deal with this question of financing of terrorism, but it's not a solution, it's not an answer. Terrorism doesn't come because people have money, it comes because of attitudes. And attitudes is where we have to place our primary concern, our primary attention if we're going to deal with the terrorism issue. I'll cite a few facts here. In the last 3 years, U.S. stock in the Arab world has gone down considerably. We now have a situation in which 9% of all Moroccans have a favorable attitude towards the United States. Moroccans, supposedly our longest standing friends in the region. 88% have an unfavorable rating, and that's been increasing, the unfavorables versus the favorables, over the last 3 years. Similarly, Jordan, where we have our closest relationship with any Arab state, 10% of Jordanians now hold a positive attitude towards the United States. 90% hold an unfavorable attitude. That is the meat and source for terrorism. That kind of attitude problem. If we want to deal with this problem of terrorism, yes, we'll deal with the financing, but more importantly, we have to deal with this kind of attitude. To pinpoint it, to highlight it, in a poll released in March by the Pew Research Center, suicide bombings, are they justifiable? By Palestinians against Israelis. Morocco, 74% say yes. Jordan, 86% of the people in Jordan say yes. More to the point for our perspective, are suicide bombings justifiable against Americans and Westerners in Iraq? Morocco, 66% yes. Jordan, 70% yes. So let us make it very clear. We can take all the financial steps in the world, but we will not change the threat to us or the threat to Americans across the Middle East until we can start to change the attitudes of the people in the region so that they find it unjustifiable to engage in suicide bombing against anyone. Now, second problem that we have generally when we're discussing such an issue as this is there is a tendency to focus on one country, Saudi Arabia. There's reasons for it. But there are 22 Arab countries, 300 million Arab citizens, all of whom pay something or supposed to pay something for Zakat, for charitable giving, and most of whom, as you've seen from these figures, are highly sensitive to the issues that drive the Middle East, particularly the Palestinian issue and Iraq. And these people want to give money to the disadvantaged, to the poor, to the people who have been expelled from their homes and so on, and they do. And there is no system in the world that can stop that kind of minimal type of donation coming from hundreds of thousands of people across the region. We can do some things to stop the big gifts. We can certainly check on the large donors, and we can encourage each of these countries to put steps in to monitor the financial flows in their charities. But it's not just a question of Saudi Arabia, it's a question of all of the countries in the region. With regard to Saudi, because that is a highlight of people's attention, Saudis were slow in taking action. I served in Saudi Arabia in the mid-'80s, and I raised this whole issue of funding terrorism with the Saudi government at the time. Our concern was that a lot of money was going to fundamentalist groups in Algeria, which were fueling the conflict in Algeria, a rather awful set of terrorist acts that took place in Algeria over many years. I was told by the Saudi officials that under their religious tenets, they could not tell an individual where to put their charitable giving, where to put their money. And that has been a significant problem for some time. That has changed now. There has been a whole set of new regulations put in place by the Saudi government in order to control charitable organizations and to control charitable giving. Keep in mind, this is not an easy task. We have had an effort in this country to control money laundering for many years. We have had efforts to control our own public's donations to charitable organizations that we put on the terrorism list. We're still not 100% effective, even here in the United States. And so we have to be aware that this is a very, very difficult task. It's a particularly difficult task in countries such as Saudi Arabia, where there is no system of income tax, where people's incomes are not monitored, where there is no organization that has been in place to check on this kind of contribution. Those organizations are being established. There are new facilities in Saudi Arabia, both in terms of U.S.-Saudi cooperation. It's very intense right now between the Treasury Department and SAMA, the Saudi Arabian Monetary Authority, in order to track large financial flows to ensure that charitable contributions are going where they're supposed to go. The Saudis have also closed down charitable organizations overseas. They have halted the practice of putting poor boxes outside of the mosques where cash contributions could be made. The net result is that there is no doubt a considerable better tracking of financial flows in Saudi Arabia. But there is a side effect, and that has been that many charitable organizations in Saudi Arabia are no longer being funded. I mean, legitimate charitable organizations, because people are afraid of what it means when they put their money out and when they are tracked by government. That will change over time. People have to get used to the new system in place. As far as I've been able to determine, the system isn't perfect. There are still leakages. There will continue to be leakages until we can answer the basic questions that revolve around, in particular, Hamas and Hezbollah. These are two organizations that do enormous amounts of charitable work, where Palestinians are absolutely dependent on Hamas for their survival, where people in southern Lebanon are being taken care of by Hezbollah. Unless we can find ways to replace those services and are willing to put up the money and the effort to replace them, then we haven't got a whole lot of chance of stopping charitable or donations to people who are seen to be in need and seen to be in the context of what Zakat and what charitable giving is all about, and that's your relationship with God. I think we are going to have some discussion of Zakat and what its meaning is by other panelists, so I won't go into it. But I do want to come back to this question. It is a long-term proposition. It takes a lot of work, and it is not a one-country specific operation. It has to be carried out everywhere in each of the Arab countries, and it also has to be tied to a broader question of the war on terrorism and what our policies are and whether people want to support us or they want to support the bad guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. We'll hear from Juliette.
As I was writing up my notes for today's panel, I could not help but note the similarities and differences between the research about my research about chefs in America and Middle East billionaires. That is not to say that I found a secret connection between Chef Wolfgang Puck and Osama bin Laden. Still, if we live in a world that is a global village, then no one should be surprised to find 6 degrees of separation or less between any two people. I'm certainly not ruling out the possibility that members of the bin Laden family ever dined at Spago, and I might add that Wolfgang Puck actually opened a Spago briefly in Kuwait, but that is another story. Anyway, I'm here to add further context to the charity terrorist funding debate, in my case among private sectors in both America and the Middle East. I've straddled both worlds for more than a decade of reporting for Forbes and Forbes Global magazines, and before that for Business Week. From 1994 to 2000, full-time, and since then freelance. I have been researching and analyzing private sector around the world, increasingly among private rather than public companies. In fact, from 1995 to 2001, I wrote the Middle East section for the Forbes annual billionaires list. The goal of the billionaires list is to find the net worth of billionaires and any important changes in their wealth compared to the previous year. I would interview the billionaires and their employees, as well as bankers familiar with their assets. Since most of the companies were private, I could compare them to companies in the same business of a similar size. Before heading out to the Middle East, let's start first with the more recognizable American market. Since the same basic research methodology is applicable to private companies anywhere, my research for the celebrity chef column for the Forbes Celebrity 100 list followed the same pattern. In fact, I've just finished nearly 3 years of in-depth research, which resulted in my book, Super Chef, published by Simon & Schuster. Super Chef examines the business empires of super chefs. The chefs are millionaires, not billionaires, and since most of their companies are private, that means my research never had the benefit of reviewing their financials, as was the case with Middle East billionaires. I had to work largely based on the information they would share, which I compared to my own growing knowledge and understanding of each company in order to assess their worth. Occasionally, I would get glimpses deep inside, especially when they cut big deals. For instance, a few years back, Wolfgang Puck sold his pizza company for a reported $20 million to ConAgra, a company so big that it refers to its business divisions broadly as food ingredients and food packaging. Like many other of America's rich, super chefs are closely involved in charitable works. In fact, Wolfgang established his own charity with his now ex-wife Barbara Lazaroff back in the early 1980s. Many top chefs today work with organizations like Share Our Strength, Meals on Wheels to combat hunger, while others concentrate their efforts on disease research. They do this because charity has become one of the most effective means of raising public awareness about their businesses. With that aim in mind, it is quite understandable that they focus on food-related charitable efforts. Most of this background should sound somewhat familiar to all of us who have a vague working notion of American private companies and American charities. This situation really changes when the venue changes from America to the Middle East, and it changes quite dramatically. For one thing, when we talk about business sectors like private and public, it is the public or government sector that dominates, particularly in the Gulf states due to the oil and gas wealth. The public sector is then confused by shifting lines that distinguish the public sector treasury from that of the royal family's wealth. In fact, for many years, Forbes did not count royalty when listing billionaires. Forbes used to consider their wealth indistinguishable from the public. Let's take a look then at this year's billionaires list from Forbes. This year, the top 5 richest people in the world in order were Bill Gates of Microsoft, Warren Buffett, Karl Albrecht, the German owner of Aldi supermarkets, and I covered him at least once for billionaires list, Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Al Saud of Saudi Arabia, whom I added to the list for the first time in 1997, and Paul Allen, also of Microsoft. Now, America's Bill Gates is a purely private businessman, but there in the same top 5 bracket globally, we now find Prince Al-Walid bin Talal, a grandson of the founding king of Saudi Arabia. While Prince Al-Walid's money may be technically his and private, it is generally understood that the origins of his wealth are originally oil revenues and thus originally public. This is something truly different from the situation in the United States. A second difference lies in corporate governance. While the commercial laws may be written down and codified in the Middle East countries, they are less transparent and regular than in America. Thus, while a family may own a private company, like a successful store, a member of the royal family might decide to take ownership of that business, in which case there is little doubt who will wind up as owner, no matter what the law states. I remember a case of a 7 to 8 digit overnight transfer of ownership of a very publicly visible property that shook the business community while I was out in the Middle East. With such legal uncertainty, the rich of the Middle East tried to keep their wealth outside the region in foreign markets to avoid risk. In country, they conduct their business dealings very quietly, so you will rarely hear about a Wolfgang Puck ConAgra-sized deal, unless it is a public tender. Consequently, as you may imagine, and I can assure you, there are many billionaires who are not on the Forbes list. I can attest to that because I have interviewed them, and they declined to be interviewed, and to share information for reasons that may or may not be those I have just cited. If I did manage to obtain financials in the Middle East, they were all too often inaccurate. Even in Turkey, which has a more transparent accounting system than many other countries in the region, accounting standards are flaunted. For instance, some families claim shares in their own publicly listed companies were worth double what I determined they were worth. All this leads up to my experience with Islamic Charity, which, by the way, started at Forbes a few years before 9/11. Not out of any American interest in the Middle East, of course, but out of interest in the growing prominence of charity in this country. By year 2000, with all the new .com money, billionaires were donating huge amounts of money for a variety of reasons, of which tax deduction, publicity, and true humanitarian concerns were among the most common. In 2000, Forbes asked me to report on the charitable works of the Middle East as part of the billionaires list, which turned out to be a perfect example of misunderstanding between two worlds. Here is what happened. Dutifully, I attempted to compile this charity list among my billionaires. Many of the billionaires patiently explained to me that while they most certainly did donate to charities, I could not connect their names to the donations or the recipients. Because in Islam, to declare one's charitable act is to erase its heavenly reward. Muslim donors, then, are generally anonymous. This is not to say that no school or hospital has ever been built in someone's name. But I believe, and the rest of the panel can help me with this, that in most cases, those donations are made in the name of a deceased relative. Otherwise, if a school or hospital is named after a living person, that is because it is a for-profit affair and not charitable. In Jeddah, for instance, you may find the hospitals such as Faki and Idris, but they are privately run for-profit businesses that generate revenue streams for their owners and are not charitable institutions. In fact, one question I have for you is the Prince Sultan bin Abdulaziz Humanitarian City nonprofit or for-profit? And since it's named after a living Saudi prince, of which there are a growing number of examples in Saudi Arabia. Speaking of nonprofits, let's take a quick step back and look at nonprofit organizations in the United States. Take an American nonprofit like the Middle East Institute. Donors to the Middle East Institute must be declared in MEI's annual report in order for MEI to maintain its nonprofit status. By comparison, in the Middle East, to list such a charity would simply deny the donors any benefit of an afterlife. The aim of this anonymity, by the way, is to ensure that donations are truly and sincerely made for humanitarian reasons. They are not made for tax deductions, because that doesn't exist in the region, nor for publicity, because publicizing charities is completely at odds with the Islamic concept of charity, as far as I understand. As a result, it was extremely difficult to ascertain the charity of the Middle East billionaires. That is not to say that my billionaires never confided in me personally about donations and recipients. Many were very kind in detailing such matters to me. The reasons they confided to me is because, first, they were familiar with me, and second, they were familiar with American journalistic ethics, so they were confident that I would never publicly connect donors with donations or recipients as they had asked. Despite this situation, I did ultimately come up with a list of Middle East donations and recipients, less the names of the donors. And this is where the final step of misunderstanding arose, because despite the information I obtained, Forbes deemed it incomplete. So the Forbes list of large charitable donations in 2000, under the title Sharing the Wealth, ranges from Bill Gates' donation of $20.8 billion to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, to Canada's Charles Bronfman's who gave $8 million to Birthright Israel. Now, somewhere between the billions that Bill Gates gave and the $8 million that Charles Bronfman gave were a number of donations made by Middle East billionaires, which I tried to have listed, less the billionaires' names. When I faced Forbes' resistance, I offered Forbes a solution: mark off the Middle East donations and explain why there were no names attached. Let people understand a bit more about charity in the rest of the world. Who knows, it might have helped some Treasury or FBI investigator in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 if anyone had been able to dig up a Forbes article that explained the reasons for namelessness in Islamic charitable donations. Instead, Forbes refused to accommodate. While, of course, the Middle East billionaires felt forbidden to compromise. And there I was, caught between two groups that could not reach a compromise on something as simple as a charity list. Middle East billionaire donors would not let their names be listed, while the American magazine publisher would not run the donations without their names. To me, this unbridgeable pre-9/11 gap in understanding is strongly indicative of the problems American investigators would face thereafter. Nor should anyone have here confuse what I'm saying. Middle East billionaires were not trying to hide their charity. As pious Muslims, they simply wanted the heavenly reward promised them in return for their donations. This gap in understanding is not unbridgeable, of course. It merely requires extra effort. After 9/11, Americans who already had demonstrated a lack of patience to understand such matters, as this case shows, tended to publicly blame Middle Eastern people who refused to go public in order to aid investigations, as they often felt they had no time to understand matters.
Thank you, Juliette. We'll hear next from Abir.
Thank you, Maya. I want to start my speech by this quote. An American wise man said, down in their hearts, wise men know this truth. The only way to help yourself is to help others. And that man is Albert Hubbard. Since our focus today is on Islamic charity and the existing humanitarian charity programs and systems, I would like to share with you a brief introduction about some of the humanitarian programs and charitable activities and systems in the kingdom by presenting the activities provided by Sultan bin Abdulaziz Foundation, a charity foundation. Charity is preached by most religions in the world, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, and Islam as well. It's a way of bringing justice to society and making fair contribution to social stability, by purifying the soul of the rich from greed and selfishness, and the soul of the poor from envy and resentment against society. To make it possible for the spring of brotherhood and solidarity to gush forth. In Islam, all human beings have been created by one and the same God. For this reason, they belong to the great brotherhood. Therefore, they must willingly come to one another and in assistance as members of one large family. Islam has therefore laid a great emphasis on the support of the dispute and disabled members in the society. It's a sacred duty of the wealthy to give part of their possessions to fulfill the need of the dispute and the deprived section of the community. There are two forms of charity in Islam, obligatory, which is called Zakat, and voluntarily, which is called Sadaqah. Zakat is done on a specific time with a specific amount or percent. On the other hand, Sadaqah is voluntarily and done at any amount, at any time given. In Saudi Arabia, the process of paying zakat and sadaqah occurred continuously by individuals and organizations. It organized actually in charitable societies. The obligatory zakat for private businesses in the kingdom is monitored, managed, and paid to the General Directorate of Zakah and Income Tax. And it's a common practice within a wealthy individuals and businessmen to regularly donate and participate in different charitable activities in different forms in the kingdom, whether it was by going directly to the individuals or the individuals, the poor and the needy comes to them and they pay them, or by generous donations to, let's say, charitable societies or organizations, which in Riyadh only we have about 23 of them. And their scope of service varies between helping the sick, the needy, the handicapped, the elderly, and children with special needs, in addition to also programs for other social services like the maternity and child and stuff like that. Now, please allow me to shed some light on the humanitarian activities managed by Sultan bin Abdulaziz Foundation. The foundation managed different humanitarian projects which focus on providing aid to the sick, the needy, and the handicapped, in addition to supporting these activities by education and research, of course using superior technology. The biggest project of the foundation is Sultan bin Abdulaziz Humanitarian City, and it's, to answer your question, it is not for profit. It's considered the largest medical rehabilitation center in the Arab world. It's built on 1.2 million square meters in Riyadh and designed mainly to provide rehabilitative services to patients. Its mission is helping people to help themselves. And its vision is to be the world center of excellence in rehabilitative services. The city was established in '96, and the grand opening was in 2002. And the budget and the fund that was taken out of the foundation, Prince Abdulaziz Sultan Foundation, was 1 billion Saudi riyal, which is about 375 million US dollars. Another humanitarian program that has been established by the foundation is a charitable housing for the poor. Compounds have been built for the needy or the poor or the homeless. And an example of it is the charity housing compound that was built in different cities in the kingdom. And the compound includes, each compound includes about 100 villas supported by schools, health centers, shopping centers, recreation facilities, and mosques. Another form of utilizing the charity fund coming from the foundation also is providing and supporting institutes that support special education. And an example of that is the coordination or the agreement done between the foundation and the Arab University, Gulf University in Bahrain, where a program for special need has been established. And since this program has been established, 33 scholarships were given, because scholarships were given to those who wants to go and study and get higher degree in special education. The foundation also funded a research project supervised by King Saud University faculty members about Alzheimer's disease in Saudi Arabia, covering 5 regions in the kingdom with a sample about 10,000 subjects. Another charitable program managed by the foundation is sponsoring patient treatment. This is a big part of the foundation programs or responsibilities. Many patients have been sponsored, whether they require treatment within the kingdom or abroad. And actually, a big percent of those patients are sponsored sometimes by Prince Sultan himself. And actually, he's known for being extremely generous, specifically when it comes to the sick or the handicapped and the elderly. That's why he earned the name of, we call him, the name he's famous for in Saudi Arabia, which is in Arabic Sultan al-Khair, which means the Prince of Good Deeds. We go back to the programs. Another academic program has been managed by the foundation is the outreach program for those visiting professors who go visit and have work here in the University of California in Berkeley. To conclude, there are widespread belief that all men are created equal in the eyes of God in terms of the intrinsic value of human soul. That fact is indisputable. However, when one considers the disparities that exist within the brotherhood of man, from birth through life, the absolute truth of that belief is called into question, insofar the mortal life is concerned. I refer specifically to those who are born with physical and mental disabilities, or those who acquire various misfortunes. those handicapped and misfortunes can prevent them actually from sharing equally in God's bounty. Those of you who have been free of such constraints, it's in our responsibility to generously share our wealth and our good fortune with them. The concept of charity is universal. And the main requirement here it's a main requirement in Islam. In Saudi Arabia, charity programs has nothing to do with race or belief. It mainly focuses on providing help to the needy, and the trend there is to help people help themselves. This includes providing education, vocational training, shelter, health. Therefore, this activities is expected to continue, but should be managed and organized carefully by the government. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Abir. Lastly, we'll hear from Hussein.
Thanks. What I'd like to do is talk about the effect of the crackdown, or let us say a backlash post 9/11 on some American Muslim charities, on the Arab American community and the American Muslim community, and what can be done about it. So I'd like to really begin by describing what happened to a very well-known and well-established American Muslim charity, and then talk about the effects that this and similar experiences have had on the community, and what might be done about it. The Holy Land Foundation was one of the largest American Muslim charities. Estimated assets about, at the time that its assets were seized and frozen, about $6 million, which makes it one of the largest such groups. And in the and not only did it have a good reputation, I think it's fair to say, among American Muslims, it had also received promotion by the State Department through one of the State Department's websites, which encouraged people to consider it one of the, there was a website, there was a section of the State Department website which pointed people in the direction of various charities, and the Holy Land Foundation was one of those for quite some time. So I think it came to many people in the American Muslim community as something of a shock when in the months following the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, the Holy Land Foundation was among a small group of charities, along with Benevolence International and Global Relief, to find its assets frozen, and the government accusing it, not formally but informally, of being connected to terrorist activities. And this was, I think, a great surprise for people. Now, this is something that the Holy Land Foundation has denied vehemently. And as a matter of fact, in March 2002, the Holy Land Foundation sued the federal government in federal court, charging that its constitutional rights had been violated in an attempt to resuscitate itself from its essentially defunct position, and to regain access to the $6 million in charitable donations that it held. What is noteworthy, by the way, is that in asset forfeiture and civil forfeiture and asset seizure, essentially what happens to anyone who is targeted by that government power is the burden of proof is reversed, right? You have to go to civil court, and you have to prove that the assets in question, because it's the assets that are targeted, not the legal person, because it's a civil case, that those assets are in fact not being used for any illegal purpose. A very difficult burden to have to meet. The government response to the Holy Land Foundation's suit was to give it 2 weeks' notice to submit material challenging the government's designation of it as a supporter of terrorism. They didn't take advantage of that because they said, we can't do it in 2 weeks. 2 weeks isn't enough time. And in May 2002, that is to say, a few weeks after the suit was launched, the government redesignated the Holy Land Foundation as a terrorist organization itself. Right. Now, the Holy Land Foundation went to court, and here in Washington, the U.S. District Court, Judge Gladys Kessler, a judge for whom I have a good deal of respect, and who's made some courageous rulings post 9/11, especially on secret detentions. But she upheld the government, and she did not allow the Holy Land Foundation to introduce any evidence to challenge the government's designation. Their Holy Land appealed, and unfortunately, the appellate court ruled that, in fact, the Holy Land Foundation had no right to submit any evidence on its behalf. And in effect, what they said was that the government's case against it, which is based, as far as I can tell, entirely on newspaper clippings, foreign intelligence reports, uncorroborated, unsworn statements, and all kinds of other evidence that would be readily challengeable in a normal court proceeding, that in fact that was so persuasive that there was no need to allow the Holy Land Foundation to submit any evidence, because they wouldn't have been able to seriously undermine the government's case against them. And then the Supreme Court on March the 1st, 2004, denied certiorari. So that case has ended. I have no idea whether the government's claims against the Holy Land Foundation are accurate. I have no opinion on it. I'd like to think that the government has a solid basis for making its conclusion. But I can tell you this: Holy Land Foundation never had anything remotely looking like its day in court, even through the civil procedures. So what looks at first glance immediately to be an end run around due process, right? Simply by seizing assets and punishing people for alleged crimes without ever having to prove the case in court, becomes even more onerous when there is no civil remedy in civil court, when the burden of proof is reversed, and what ought to be litigated in a criminal court setting is pushed into civil court, and then in civil court plaintiff is not able to present its case. A remarkable occurrence, and that is essentially what has happened with the largest charity, the charity that has pursued its efforts against the government. I think it's fair to say they ran right into a solid brick wall. And that's where it's going to stay, since the Supreme Court doesn't seem to be interested in hearing that case. Now, I think it's fair to say that having seen well-known charities like the Holy Land Foundation, as well as other groups that had different reputations but that were more or less known to the community, groups like Global Relief, and to a much lesser extent, Benevolence International, but certainly known Islamic charities in the United States falling under deep suspicion, and these accusations from the government, and having their assets frozen and more or less becoming defunct, that a serious chill went through the community. And I'll discuss a little bit more the effect that this had on fundraising by charities and by other Islamic and Arab American groups in the United States in a second. But I think that it would be a sort of an obvious reaction for other Americans to say, well, what are you getting so worked up about? I mean, these are few groups, and maybe they had a good reputation because they were doing things secretly, so why are you so worked up? I mean, why is the community so upset about what's happened to a few $1 million and a few organizations and a few people? A reasonable question, and the question is there a basis for this anxiety? And I think the answer is clearly yes. I think people need to know that it goes. The intimidation and the atmosphere of anxiety is based on a lot more than simply the freezing of assets of a few charities, some of which were well known. It's true that no one so far has faced criminal penalties because they gave to an institution that subsequently had its assets frozen. All right, that's true enough. And that actually is the underlying fear. I mean, everyone who looks into this says, well, the reason that it casts a chill is that people are worried that if they give to an organization in good faith that right now has a good reputation and right now has no accusations against it, what happens in 3 years' time when suddenly accusations emerge out of the blue and they may find themselves on some list, or they may find themselves accused of something, or it may become a stigma to have been known to have given to that organization, in spite of the fact that it was done before there were any accusations, before there was any freezing, and in spite of the fact that everything would suggest that it was done in good faith. Well, there are a number of very disturbing cases, and I'm not going to go through all. I'm just going to give you 2 examples of why it's actually completely understandable that the community would have that reaction. The first is, there have been a number of cases like this, but there is the case of the Arab-American businessman Jess Mali in Orlando. He owns a string of tourism-related gift stores and restaurants on the main drag there. I can't remember what it's called in Orlando that goes between the theme parks and what have you. And he's a well-to-do guy, and he was arrested last year on charges of money laundering and hiring of illegal immigrants. And they were the same charge. Essentially, the charge against him was that he hired illegal immigrants to work in his businesses. That's something that is not uncommon at all for businesses and business people to face in South Florida and in other parts of the country. Southwest Airlines and what have you. The list of companies in his area that have faced similar charges is very long. So we know basically how those kinds of offenses are generally dealt with, right? He didn't have the same experience as most business people with, accused of the same thing. His home and offices were raided by a very large number of heavily armed police officers. He was accused of a very long list of criminal charges that are usually not associated with these kinds of with this generalized offense. And what's more important is the government sought to deny him bail. All right, and at the bail hearing, the judge said, well, why should I deny this guy bail when these cases come up routinely in front of me? And what's this? And the government, the district attorney, or assistant district attorney down there, I believe, said, well, we have reason to believe that this man has financial links to organizations in the Middle East that advocate violence. And thankfully, the judge didn't take their word for that, and it came out that what they were talking about is this man had given money to the Holy Land Foundation, the charity I was just describing, years ago, although large donations, but back when it was an organization that was not under any accusation or any cloud of suspicion, when it was legitimate and clearly done it in good faith. Now, thankfully, the judge in the Mali case saw through it and said, look, I can't deny somebody bail based on this. This is absurd, and Jess Mali got bail. But what's interesting is that the media in Orlando was not as responsible as the judge. The media picked up on these innuendos, and the whole thing was described by one TV station down there as the tourism for terrorism case. Now, I remind you, this is a completely apolitical charge. This is it's a common businessman's offense. And I take no position, again, on Jess Mali and his business activities and whether or not he hired illegal immigrants and did some fiddling with the books to pay them, which is exactly what he's being accused of. But I do think it was a very cynical effort to use his ethnicity as an Arab American, number one. And number two, the fact that he had donated in good faith to a charity that subsequent to his donations got into hot water in an attempt to deny him bail and put him in jail before he was convicted, when under any other person, certainly non-Arab American, non-American Muslims, would not have found themselves in that situation. So that is a pretty good example. And there are other cases, but just give you that one. I'll give you another example, a completely different kind of example. The U.S. Attorney in Detroit, Jeffrey Collins, another man for whom I have a lot of respect, mind you. And I'm not trying to pick on people I don't like. I like Judge Kessler and I like Jeffrey Collins. He was trying to work with the local Arab American and American Muslim community in Detroit, and there are very good relations between the authorities in Detroit, both state and federal and local, and the Arab and Muslim communities in Detroit, because of a lot of good work done by lots of people, including my former colleague Ahmed Hamad. And Mr. Collins was trying to talk to people during Ramadan of 2002 about how they could give their zakat, Ramadan being the month of fasting where zakat is a particularly respected institution and obligation, indeed. Mr. Collins passed out a list of organizations deemed terrorist by the U.S. government and warning people not to give to these organizations. Well, fine. But he was then pressed by the audience, who asked him, well, you know, how do we avoid getting into this situation that I just described with Mr. Mali, right? Or even more serious versions of it. And he said, well, you just don't give to any group that's known to have terrorist ties. And they said, well, of course we wouldn't do that. We know that, thank you very much. But what we want to know is, how do we avoid giving in good faith and then getting in trouble later, right? Since you're and his answer was, and this is a direct quote, it's a common sense thing. If you don't know, you don't know. That's what he said. Well, I don't know. And I mean, one would have to ask how anyone really is supposed to know, particularly when there are all these dire warnings and people are taken by surprise. And then their good faith contributions are held against them in the future, including by U.S. attorneys. Now, all of this has, as I said, cast a pall. And there is some dispute, in fact, about how much of a hit American Muslim charities and other groups have faced as a result of this. It's pretty clear that in 2002, 2003, donations generally were down. In some places, we have evidence that they were down. Some people say 25%, some people say 40%. But clearly there was a serious blow to charitable giving. The other thing that happened, and this is very noteworthy, is that rather than paying with or donating through checks or credit cards, right, in which the money would be associated with a name and a bank account, people preferred, especially in 2003, 2004, to give cash. Right? They didn't mind giving money, but they just didn't want their name to get on a list. They didn't want to get into some Orwellian nightmare. And that's the fear out there. And as I say, it's not an entirely fanciful one, given Mr. Mali's experiences. Now, I can say, I think, with some confidence, having worked in a large national Arab American organization, it wasn't just charities that suffered. I think any organization with the name Arab or the name Islamic in it suffered as a result of this fear of the consequence of being involved in such activities. Now, whether donations have rebounded or not is a subject of some debate. Riyad Abdul Karim of Kinder USA, who's been well known for his efforts in these regards, has written an article at the beginning of this year in which he states very strongly his opinion that giving has rebounded, and that especially at the local level, it's as strong or stronger than it has been before, because the community is coming together and overcoming its fears and what have you. He cites a mosque that was able to raise $1 million in Chicago in one night for building a new facility and things like that. And I think there's some truth that other organizations continue to report a kind of deterioration in their ability to get funding. So I think I think we can be pretty sure that there has been a chill, and that the chill continues. And even if there's been a rebound at the local level, that's probably not. There isn't any good evidence that I can find that that's happening at a national level. Now, two final areas I want to look at. First, what can be done about this situation? Because what we're looking at here is not only a question of fairness, right? It's also a question of equal rights, equal protection of the law, and there is even a First Amendment issue here, right? Free exercise. Zakat is an obligation. The typical interpretation of zakat is 2.5% of income should go to zakat. I mean, this is not, and this is not a subject in great dispute among different schools of Islam. There's a real consensus about zakat being an obligation. And if government actions are casting such a chill that they are interfering with, if not prohibiting, or certainly complicating unnecessarily, the free exercise of religion in terms of making zakat a risky business or a source of anxiety rather than a source of spiritual upliftment, which is supposed to come with the exercise of religion, that's a problem, and that's something we should deal with. There are at least two things that the government could do to help rectify the negative effects of its actions. I'm not saying the government shouldn't have done what it did. I'm saying we don't know on what basis they took their actions. And even if the government is entirely justified, although we'll probably never know with regard to Holy Land Foundation because of the atrocious rulings of the courts, certainly it has created an incidental problem that the government should deal with in terms of facilitating this aspect of the exercise of the Islamic faith. The first is that these let me reverse it. Let me do the second one first. If the government is going to be in the business of stigmatizing charitable organizations, of freezing their assets, and of holding, at least in the form of district attorneys around the country, holding people who gave in good faith responsible for that and punishing them for that, then the government could do the opposite as well. In other words, rather than just relying on the voluntary guidance for charitable organizations that was issued by the Treasury after a number of Arab American and Muslim organizations pressured the Treasury to do that, they could and should go further. All right, they could and should have an accreditation program. They could and should have a way of taking proactive measures to reassure people that charities X, Y, and Z, Islamic charities that do thus and such good works, are not, considered suspect, and that they have voluntarily complied with these guidelines, and that there is some sort of an accreditation system. Now, it certainly sits badly in a society where church and state are supposed to be separate and where the government is not supposed to get involved in the free exercise of religion. But if the government is going to create a stigma, the least it can do is create some mechanism to give people some relief from that stigma if it wanted to. And I just don't see any barrier to actually doing that if they wanted. The second thing that could be done, and this is something that Salam al-Mariyati, the executive director of MPAC, the Muslim Public Affairs Council, an excellent organization, has been pushing for some time, is that the funds that remain, right, the funds that are still available in the assets of the frozen assets of the charities that have become defunct as a result of unilateral government action, could be released to other charities. In other words, this money was not given for the legal defense fund of Benevolence International and Global Relief and the Holy Land Foundation. This money was given by Muslims out of a charitable impulse to do good works, and it should be used insofar as possible in that regard. From what I can tell, all the frozen assets of Benevolence and Global Relief seem to have been spent on their legal fees. So this is zakat that was intended for the poor and the needy that went to some attorneys, some trial attorneys and some accounting attorneys, forensic attorneys, or whatever. That's not zakat, and it's not proper. There is still money in the Holy Land for Relief and Development, the Holy Land Foundation for Relief and Development. They still have cash. The $6 million has not been exhausted by their legal efforts. And I think that the government and other organizations could and should look for ways of transferring that money. And in fact, there was, and this is my final point, there was an effort to do that. Earlier this year, in April, in fact, Palestine Children's Relief Fund, which is an interfaith organization run by a guy, Mr. Sosby, who was born as a Catholic and is now an agnostic. Good for him. And I'm an agnostic, whatever. Anyway, who wanted and with the cooperation of the former directors of the Holy Land Foundation, to get $50,000 for Palestinian children's relief. Desperately needed, as Ambassador Walker pointed out, desperately needed in places like the Gaza Strip and West Bank, where people are wretched and destitute, and where that wretchedness and destitution has security implications, I might add, as Ambassador Walker also pointed out. As far as I can tell, no mechanism has been found to do this. By the way, revenues of Palestine's Children Relief Fund dropped 33% in 2002. I can tell you that. I haven't been able to discover whether or not that's gone through, but I don't think it has, and it should. And it absolutely should. I just want to say one final thing about Palestine Children's Relief Fund, to give you, just to reiterate the kind of pall that exists in the popular culture about Islamic and Arab American relief services. There's an NBC movie that was shown a few months ago. I think it was a pilot of a show, or I think it was a movie called Homeland Security. In one scene, an investigator asked a professor who is suspected of having links to al-Qaeda about his support for, quote, the Palestinian Children's Relief Fund, which is different only in Palestine and Palestinian from Palestine Children's Relief Fund, the excellent organization I was talking about. Of course, Mr. Sosby and the Palestine Children's Relief Fund were inundated with both concern and hostile messages from viewers who learned that his innocent organization was a front for, as the professor said, quote, PCRF is a front for Islamic jihad, close quote. Right. So I think that gives you a sense of the extent to which Islamic and Arab American charitable giving has been stigmatized, and the degree to which that has posed a problem for a perfectly legitimate humanitarian work in our community. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Hussein.
Sure.
Thank you to our panelists. I want to go ahead and start the question and answer part of our program. Taking the prerogative as the moderator, I'm going to ask the first question of Ambassador Walker. Hussein focused on the domestic government action, meaning what we're doing here in the United States to address these issues. There's also been some U.S.-Saudi joint initiatives that have taken place to address some of these problems internationally. If you could just touch upon that point briefly.
Well, we set up with the Saudis a joint monitoring operation inside Saudi Arabia between the Treasury Department and the Saudi officials, and that is designed to determine what steps need to be taken, the kinds of steps that have already been taken, but also monitoring the effectiveness of these steps, because it's not enough just to say you're going to do something. You've got to actually do it and make it work. There's been a lot of close cooperation between the Treasury Department and the Saudi officials in this regard. My understanding from my friends at Treasury is that they are satisfied with that cooperation. The people at Treasury understand the complications that are involved in setting up any such new system in order to make it fully effective. But there's been a great deal of progress over the past year.
Very good. Let's go ahead and take your questions and answers. If I can ask you to identify yourself by name and affiliation, please, in the back.
I represent an organization called the Friends of Charities Association. It's a group of Saudi-based charities, including some of the largest Muslim World League, International Islamic Relief Organization. I'd like to address a concern that we have about really due process in the press and on Capitol Hill, about the ability to get to the factual basis for issues that involve the charities. And I'll give you two examples. One is the Washington Post a couple of months ago reported in a front-page article that the Muslim World League was founded by Osama bin Laden. Now, Osama bin Laden was born in 1957, and the League was founded in 1962. So he was a very precocious 5-year-old, if that statement was true. Now, the Post retracted that the next day, but of course that got no notice, and it's accepted that among some that this was the case. Another example is in the a report issued recently by the Council on Foreign Relations. An allegation was made that the International Islamic Relief Organization was kicked out of Kenya following the '98 embassy bombings. They didn't report that they were formally cleared of any wrongdoing and welcomed back into Kenya. So you have an allegation that then is in a formal report by the CFR that's presented to a Senate committee, and on the basis of that, the chairman of the committee calls upon the Saudi government to crack down, whatever that means, on these two organizations. I went up to the author of the report and said, you never contacted any of these organizations about which you make allegations. My group is organized to enter into dialogue with think tanks, with lawmakers and others, and you can pick up the phone and call Saudi Arabia and say, I'd like the facts. And that process isn't taking place, and I wonder if your panelists could comment on that.
What happens when this stuff enters public consumption like this? Any of you?
Well, I mean, there are two things. First of all, there's the broad question of misunderstanding and mistakes, which probably explains the post-incident. So, it's a matter of diligence. But there's also, let's be fair. There are two agendas out there. There's an agenda that says, look, some terrorist organizations have used funding through charities. Let's find out about it. Let's stop it. Let's see how it was done. And there's another agenda which says, look, for some political interest, in the interests of some domestic or foreign political interest, we wish to smear people generally. So, in other words, there certainly are those out there in the media and possibly in Congress as well who have an anti-Arab, anti-Saudi, anti-Egyptian, anti-Jordanian, etc. agenda. And there are various different motivations for this. Extreme right-wing evangelicals, extreme right-wing supporters of Israel, others who might feel that it's in their interest to paint every Arab and every Muslim in the worst possible light at every moment. Those people are out there too. So I think the only way to go forward is for everyone to keep in mind the distinction between those two things. The distinction between a serious effort to uncover and stop the misuse of charitable funds and extraneous political agendas that are simply prejudiced and bigoted. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, right here.
My name is Sarah, and I have a question for Mr. Hussein. I'm from Georgetown University. Mm-hmm. I was just wondering if you saw any alternative for the government other than closing Islamic charities that are tied to terrorism, right. And what should the government do if it discovers that an organization is funding terror surreptitiously?
Right. Yes. The answer to that question is no. There's no alternative but to close a charity or any other organization, for that matter, that's engaged in the support of terrorism or any other criminal activity whatsoever. There should be no hesitation to investigate them aggressively. There should be no hesitation to shut them down. There should be no hesitation to prosecute them to the full extent of the law. I don't see any problem with any of those things. The problem with examples like the Holy Land Foundation is that there's no due process here, is that neither has the accused been afforded any opportunity to rebut the allegations or to subject the government's own information to interrogation. I mean, certainly we see in criminal cases all the time that the government believes something because it's in possession of information that either it doesn't understand or is incomplete, and that in fact the adversarial process, sometimes even during discovery, right, serves to change the government's mind. I'm not sitting here questioning the government's opinion about the Holy Land Foundation. That's not what I'm doing. What I'm saying is we have a system in this country for determining the truth and for punishing people, and it's the adversarial system. And it seems to me you can't square what happened to the Holy Land Foundation with due process. And I think we need to hold on to due process. So I remember very well when the funds were frozen, and I worked for ADC at the time, and a lot of people asked me, what do you think? And my answer then, and for a long time after that, was, look, we trust the government knows what it's doing. We have to believe the government knows a lot of things we don't know. And we understand if they have this information and they're not ready to bring indictments yet, and they're not ready to pursue criminal charges against individuals who've been breaking the law in this manner, we understand they might want to freeze those assets first as a prelude, right, as has been done in drug cases in the past, for instance, with civil forfeiture against so-called drug kingpins. Right? We understand how that might work. But in the end, the government is going to have to pony up here. The government is going to have to make the case somehow, or at least there has to be some due process. Now, neither thing has happened. No charges have been brought, no criminal charges against any of these people. If what the government says about the Holy Land Foundation is true, people have committed very serious crimes. And I think they ought to be held accountable. And I don't understand what the problem is. If, on the other hand, the government wants to keep this in civil court, for sure, the appellate court and Judge Kessler made a mistake. For sure, the Holy Land Foundation must have a hearing at which they are able to make their case, even if it has to be against a summary of the evidence, even if it has to be an attenuated form of due process. To have no due process is un-American. I think it's unconstitutional. This is not a sensational enough case, because it just involves money, that is not going to get a lot of attention now, and maybe even in the future. People won't look back on this as a major scandal. But I think in legal circles, it will be looked back upon as a mistake, as a black eye, and not necessarily the government's mistake, but the court's mistake, especially the appellate court. And they're ruling that they just find the government's case so overwhelming that there's no point in allowing Holy Land to introduce any evidence. That's a scandalous ruling. And I think in the end we will regret that our courts did that.
Thank you. Yes, right here.
Yes, my name is Martin McMahon. I'm in private practice and I've been working in the Muslim and Arab American community for some 25 years or so. I just wanted to address this to Hussein. What I advise my clients to keep the zakat going is 3 months before the contribution, they send a letter to their congressman, they send a letter to OFAC, which is this Office of Foreign Assets Control at Treasury, and they send a letter to the Justice Department. And they say, dear sirs, contemplating giving to charity X, want to make sure they're not on anybody's radar screen. We'll be making contribution 3 months from now if I don't hear from you.
Right.
What that does is puts the onus on the government
Right.
to suggest to you, you should not make that contribution.
It indemnifies people to some extent, yeah.
It protects you, you see, from an indictment. And you didn't mention this, but we're involved in the 9/11 families lawsuit. That's where they're going, and they've brought people into that lawsuit. And I would just mention to anybody here who lives in Virginia or whatever, there's a grand jury sitting in the Eastern District of Virginia, and for those who don't know it, it's referred to as the Rocket Docket. And this is where all the terrorist cases are going. Moussawi's there. And the grand jury is looking into individuals who contributed to entities that may have ties to Hamas. That's how serious things are. So,
Yeah. Wouldn't it be better if there were a system of accreditation? Is all I can say.
we're working on that
Yeah.
with the Treasury Department
Right.
because we wanted to be able to get a stamp of approval that you've done due
Yeah.
diligence on
Yeah.
charity X,
Right.
and there shouldn't be an issue then.
Yeah.
That dialogue is rocky at the moment because of political considerations, as you might.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Let's get a question right here in the corner.
Is there any place, has there been a study?
Your name and
Sorry, my name's A, I'm from Tribune. Is there any place or anywhere to see how the charities have gone down, the Muslim and Arab charities, like in this country, or maybe even abroad, like Muslim Americans or Arab Americans not sending charity abroad? Is there anywhere to see these statistics?
What was the question?
Anywhere to identify how much contributions have gone down to both Arab and Muslim charities, if there's been a study on this.
I couldn't find it. I looked for it and I couldn't find it. You can always look at people's tax returns and find out information a year old. But that I don't know of any journalist who's done that.
We had another question there. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, I have a question about this accreditation. I'm surprised.
I'm sorry, your name and affiliation.
Sorry, Daniel Kelly from the Global Work Ethic Fund. I'm surprised that that's an issue because if we're talking about contributions to United States-based 501c3s, you're chartered and you are given tax-exempt status, although I understand every organization that you may want to give to does not have tax-exempt status, but for all of them, you can lose your status for not complying with your charter, for one, and with
look,
United States law.
but here's the thing. Those three charities were all 501c3s, right? That status, giving to a 501c3 doesn't indemnify you at all. Unfortunately,
You're talking about accrediting.
Yeah.
That is your accreditation.
But it isn't, though. See, here's the thing. Well, think of it from the point of view of the giver, right? Let's step back. I mean, there are the Treasury guidelines there, but think of it from the point of view of his clients or the givers. You know, you want to give a bunch of money, right? And yet you've seen all the stuff we've been talking about, and you're very, very nervous. Not only because of the general chill, but because of the Mali case and because of what U.S. Attorney Collins said. And you're just, there are grounds to be concerned here. The fact that you're giving to a 501c3 is unfortunately not a satisfactory answer, because everything that I discussed, at least, and that others have mentioned, happened within the context of 501c3 status. So that was not, it didn't help.
No, I'm looking for enlightenment here, because that is your accreditation.
Yeah, there has to be something beyond that, because of what happened to the other groups, and because because people like Attorney Collins, who I respect, have not been willing to say that's your. I mean, that's not the government's position at all. The government has warned people: be careful. Don't give to anyone who you might think or there's reason to believe might be doing well, and then the answer is, well, if you don't know, you don't know. That really means don't give to anybody. And I think, as I said before, if you go back before 9/11, you might have said 501c3 status is your accreditation. But since then, clearly there's been a change, and I think some kind of I think the onus is on the government to create some kind of a mechanism to help people carry out their religious obligation under those circumstances.
And I think what you want is them to yank the 501c3 status rapidly.
Or at least the presumption that it means something.
Yeah, I think the conditions have changed, and what used to be under 501c3 no longer necessarily is what's needed today, and I think that's one of the key factors. It's very much the same thing in Saudi Arabia. They had, for example, the Haramain Society, which was identified in some of its branches with giving money to terrorist organizations. What the Saudis had to do was they had to close these or suspend the operations of all of the Haramain outside of Saudi Arabia. They closed the branches in Croatia, Albania, Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, Indonesia, Pakistan, and I believe some others since that time, until they can provide a security clearance to the organization and the people in the organization to ensure that that money is not being diverted, as well as all the various steps that they're taking with the advice of Treasury on how to maintain control over the funds once they go there. So a whole new process is being put in place in order to provide just that certification that you're talking about, but I don't think that's taking place in this country.
More questions? Yes, right here.
I'm Jennifer Bremer with the Keenan Institute. And the question I have is with regard to the government accreditation. I'm wondering whether a more sort of feasible alternative might be for the charities to develop a self-accreditation and self-policing kind of function, because I think it would be very difficult. You're never going to get a negative determination from the government that XYZ is not doing something that it shouldn't. They just won't do that, I don't think. But I think the self-accreditation, which would also have other benefits in terms of being a model for other countries that also have real issues with regard to charitable governance, that I was wondering if there was any comment on that kind of an option.
Why not?
Let's take a next question.
My name is Charles Stevenson. I was for 30 years with the General Counsel's Office of the United States Agency for International Development, the Foreign Aid Program. And in that capacity, I helped facilitate assistance to both sides in the Middle Eastern arena. As the United States government was helping both sides in the Middle Eastern arena in different ways. My question is, it seems clear that the United States government has a strong interest in resolving the underlying situations in the Middle East. Indeed, this administration has a strong interest in doing so before the elections coming up in November. Do you think that things are beginning to wind down in the Middle East in ways that will defuse the animosities underlying some of these situations?
I take it that's more or less directed to me. I clearly can't say that the problems are winding down in Iraq yet. I think a major step has been taken forward. I think it's a very positive step. I think that the new Prime Minister Alawi has done the right things, said the right things in the first days that he's been in office. Also, moving Bremer out and Negroponte in is a very positive step. That situation is going to depend on a couple of factors, not all of which are under our control. One is that the United States government starts delivering aid. It's unforgivable that the situation is the way it is today after so long, and no funds, or relatively few funds, have been expended, relatively few contracts have been made, and very little progress has been made in restoring basic services like electricity, securing the oil fields and the pipelines and so on. So that's one major thing, reconstruction. And I certainly hope that in that process that the new government of Iraq gets the credit for anything that goes right, because if we start taking credit for everything, for every school that's built and so on, it's going to undermine that government. The second thing is the credibility of the Iraqi government. Is it making its decisions, regardless of what we think? And do people see it as making its decisions? And I think that's going to be critical as to their success or failure in the short term. I certainly hope that we have turned the corner and we are moving in the right direction now. I've been encouraged by the steps that have been taken recently by the U.S. administration. I think they are now moving in the right direction. On the more important question, frankly, for the region, which is the Palestinian question, such motion that's taken place has been largely the motion of Prime Minister Sharon, Hosni Mubarak, and the Palestinian leadership in trying to come up with a formula that works for the Gaza and withdrawal settlements. I don't see very much of a U.S. hand in that. I would like to see a lot more active position on the part of the administration in trying to resolve that problem, because that is the one that people refer to consistently as the one thing that affects their opinion of the United States in such a negative manner. I expect that you're right. It won't take, we won't have a major movement forward there until after our elections.
Let's go. Question here.
Tom Lippman, Middle East Institute. I have a question about our anonymous billionaires. To the extent that you were able to learn anything about their charitable donations, where did those donations go and for what purpose?
And I was actually speaking largely of Saudis, some of the Gulf, obviously in Turkey, Jordan, Egypt. I was able to determine those donations were going towards schools, towards hostels, towards hospitals, good works like that.
And by what standards was the effectiveness of the money, or did they maintain any control or knowledge about what the money actually purchased?
A lot of it was done by their own. They would set up foundations themselves and distribute money themselves, and not give to another organization. So in that sense, it was very effective as far as they knew. I didn't discuss, those were the largest blocks of funds, and I was looking for extremely large donations by the wealthiest. And there, of course, many of these people give smaller funds quite often to poor who come for food to their houses. At Ramadan, they distribute meat, pelts from slaughtered animals. So that there's lots of other smaller donations that I actually don't know about. The large ones that are largely under their own direction and are effective.
Let's take a question back here.
My name is John Ball with Talk Radio News. I have a question for Hussein. You said prior to the different organizations having their assets frozen that they were, I think, given like a 2-week period to try to prove...
No. Let me clarify that. After the Holy Land Foundation sued the government, well, first the government froze the assets, right? Then the Holy Land Foundation in March, I believe, of 2002, in March of 2002, the Holy Land Foundation filed suit in federal court to try to regain control of its assets, to try to become functional again. And at that, the following month, in response to that, so in April, the Treasury Department told the Holy Land Foundation that it intended to redesignate it as a terrorist organization in response to this suit, and gave Holy Land Foundation 2 weeks to submit material challenging allegations in the government's memo to them, which included these press clippings and what have you. And they said there wasn't enough time, and in May the government went ahead and redesignated them an actual terrorist organization.
Okay, then
yeah.
Sort of as a quick follow-up then, was the 2 weeks just that they had the information but they didn't have enough time to compile it?
Yeah, that's what they say. I'll quote from one of their attorneys, Mr. Boyd. He said, quote, "We said that's not right, it's not enough time." He said they couldn't do it, and so they didn't try. I can understand that. I mean, 2 weeks is not a long time for attorneys to challenge anything. And as far as the Holy Land Foundation is concerned, that was their hearing. That's what Mr. Boyd has said. That was our hearing. The 2-week notification window in which they had the opportunity to try to submit materials challenging the government's voluminous memo to them announcing their intention to redesignate them, which they subsequently followed up on. I mean, this whole thing happened in a matter of a few weeks. And that's all, again, I'm not particularly faulting the government. I don't think that's the way they should have proceeded, but the real problem is the reaction of the courts, particularly the appellate court.
Question right here.
For Mrs. al-Fouti.
Yes.
Dave Ottaway from the Washington Post. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the Al-Saud Foundation. Which branch of the Al-Sauds?
What I'm presenting is Sultan bin Abdulaziz Foundation. That's what I'm presenting.
Well, your money is coming from the Al-Saud Foundation.
From Sultan bin Abdulaziz Foundation.
Sultan?
Yes, Sultan bin Abdulaziz Foundation.
So it's all coming from Prince Sultan?
Yes, and his actually, on the board of trustees is his sons. Okay. Yeah.
And then how much of it is charity work abroad, and how have these new regulations affected the foundation's charity work abroad?
Well, most of the programs that I presented actually are done in the kingdom. It's for, as I mentioned, academic program at the university in Bahrain, and the city, Sultan bin Abdulaziz city, is the huge, the biggest program of the foundation, and most of the money, as I mentioned, 1 billion Saudi riyal was put in that program, and it's the main program. In addition to some activities that goes to the education and scholarships. So that's it. That's most of it is internal.
No charity work abroad.
There is actually a committee called the Sultan Committee for Relief, and it was in mostly in Niger and in Africa, where he saw a lady who was looking for food in an ant hall in Africa, and on some of the TVs, and he asked for a committee to be formed to go there and assist the situation, and then a committee was established to go and help there. But that's as far as I know about the abroad activities.
Thank you very much. I think actually that concludes our forum today, and apologize because we're almost out of time entirely. I want to thank our panelists, thank everyone for being here. I want to let you know that our next forum, which will focus on Arab reforms, movements in the region, will be Monday, July 12th. If you want to make a note of that, we'd love to have you join us again. And thank you again for being with us.
For more information on